I sat in the back of the Uber on my way to my parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner, watching the familiar suburban streets blur past my window. My phone buzzed with another email from my wealth management team at Goldman Sachs, and I quickly swiped it away before the driver could catch a glimpse of the seven-figure balance in the preview. This was my seventh Thanksgiving as a self-made multimillionaire, and my family still had absolutely no idea. My name is Caroline Mitchell, and at 32 years old, I have built a tech consulting empire that specialized in cybersecurity for Fortune 500 companies. My net worth had just crossed $15.2 million last quarter, but as far as my family knew, I was still their disappointing daughter who played with computers and couldn't seem to find a husband. The Uber pulled up to the sprawling colonial house where I grew up, the same house where my older sister Victoria lived rent-free with her husband and two kids, all bankrolled by our parents. I smoothed down my cream cashmere sweater, deliberately chosen from Laurel Piana's latest collection, though I'd carefully removed the tags. My Bottega Veneta bag looked expensive, but not so expensive that it would raise questions. I had gotten very good at hiding in plain sight. As I walked up the brick pathway, I could already hear the chaos inside, children shrieking, my brother-in-law's booming laugh, and underneath it all, my mother's voice directing traffic like a drill sergeant. "Caroline, finally," my mother, Margaret, said as she opened the door, barely looking at me as she turned back to the kitchen. "We were starting to think you weren't coming, again." She was wearing her usual Thanksgiving uniform of pressed slacks and a silk blouse, her ash blonde hair pulled back in a tight chignon. "Victoria and James got here an hour ago. They brought homemade pies, 3 of them." "Traffic was bad," I said simply, knowing that any explanation would fall on deaf ears. I stepped inside and was immediately accosted by my 8-year-old nephew Connor, who grabbed my legs in a hug that was more tackle than greeting. My sister Victoria appeared from the living room, looking absolutely perfect in a designer dress that I happened to know cost $3,000 because I'd seen it at Bergdorf Goodman last month. The difference was that Victoria's dress was paid for by her parents, while I could have bought the entire rack without checking my bank balance. "Oh, Caroline, you're here," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We were just talking about you, actually. Mom was wondering if you'd finally hired a professional matchmaker. She read an article about how successful women in their 30s are using them now." She air-quoted the word successful in a way that made it clear she didn't consider me part of that category. I forced a smile and hung my coat in the closet, the same closet where I used to hide during particularly brutal family dinners when I was younger. "Still happily single," I said. "My company's been keeping me pretty busy." "Your little computer thing," my father, Roger, said, emerging from his study with a glass of scotch already in hand. "Still doing that? I was telling Bob Henderson at the club that my daughter runs some kind of tech support business. He said his nephew does the same thing, makes about $40,000 a year. Is that about what you're pulling in?" He didn't wait for an answer before turning to my brother-in-law, James. "Now, James here, he's bringing in the real money in commercial real estate. What was your commission on that last deal, son? 200,000? James puffed out his chest slightly. 250 actually, and that's just one property. I've got 3 more closing next month." He clapped my shoulder in what was probably meant to be a friendly gesture. "I should give you some career advice sometime, Caroline. Help you figure out how to monetize those tech skills into something more lucrative. Maybe I could introduce you to some people." I nodded politely, thinking about how my company had just signed a 5-year contract with a major financial institution worth $8.3 million. I had personally negotiated that deal over dinner in Manhattan 3 weeks ago, wearing a custom Armani suit and sitting in a private dining room that cost more than James's monthly mortgage. But sure, I definitely needed career advice from someone who still asked his parents for down payment help. Dinner was the usual affair, with my mother's perfectly roasted turkey taking center stage on the antique dining table that had been in our family for generations. The table that would supposedly go to Victoria when our parents passed, along with most of their estate, because she had given them grandchildren and stability. I had been explicitly told this during last year's Christmas dinner, when my mother had too much wine and decided to discuss her will over dessert. We all took our seats, with Victoria and James and their kids occupying one entire side of the table, while I sat alone on the other side, directly across from their picture-perfect family tableau. My mother brought out dish after dish, each one with a story about how Victoria had helped with the recipe or how the grandchildren had been so excited to help set the table. "Caroline, you're looking thin," my mother said as she passed me the mashed potatoes. "Are you eating properly? You know Victoria meal preps every Sunday for her whole family? Maybe she could teach you. You might find it easier to attract someone if you had better domestic skills." Victoria smiled sweetly. "I'd be happy to help. I know it's hard when you're alone and working such long hours at that tech support job. Do you at least have time to go to the gym? I've been doing hot yoga every morning at 6. James watches the kids." I took a sip of wine, a Chateau Margaux that my father had opened for the occasion, not knowing that I had 3 cases of the same vintage in my climate-controlled wine cellar at my penthouse in Tribeca. "I actually do Pilates with a private instructor," I said carefully. "It fits my schedule better." My father laughed. "Private instructor? That must cost a fortune. Are you going into debt for that kind of thing, Caroline? Because we can't bail you out if you're living beyond your means. We're already supporting Victoria and the grandkids." "I'm not in debt, Dad. I'm doing fine financially." "Fine isn't great," he countered. "Fine is what people say when they're barely getting by. You should see if your sister's company is hiring. Didn't you say they needed an IT person, Victoria?" Victoria nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, we do actually. It's an entry-level position, only pays about $55,000, but at least it would be stable. You could finally stop being so secretive about your work situation. Mom and I were talking, and we think you might be embarrassed about how little you're making." I set down my fork very carefully, feeling the familiar burning sensation in my chest that I'd learned to associate with these family gatherings. But what they didn't know was that in my purse, my phone was buzzing with notifications from Forbes, where I was being featured in next month's 30 Under 40 issue for disrupting the cybersecurity industry. The photo shoot was last week in a Manhattan studio, and I'd worn a Roland Mouret dress that cost more than Victoria's entire wardrobe. "I appreciate the concern," I managed to say, "but I'm happy with my current position." My mother sighed dramatically. "You're so stubborn, Caroline, just like you were when you were little. Remember when she refused to do pageants, Roger? While Victoria was winning titles and scholarships, Caroline was hiding in her room with those computers." She turned to Victoria. "Thank God one of my daughters turned out normal." The rest of dinner continued in much the same vein, with every conversation somehow circling back to either Victoria's accomplishments or my apparent lack thereof. We heard about Victoria's charity work, her children's achievements, her husband's business success, and her recent feature in the local newspaper for her volunteer work. I nodded and smiled and said, "That's wonderful," approximately 37 times. Then came dessert, and with it, the moment that would change everything. My mother stood up, clinking her wine glass with her fork to get everyone's attention. "Before we have pie, I need to discuss something important with everyone." She looked around the table, her eyes landing on me with an expression I'd seen countless times before, a mixture of disappointment and expectation. "I need to ask for money. Again." The way she said "again" was pointed, a direct reference to the last 3 Thanksgivings when she'd made similar announcements. Each time, she'd asked for contributions to help Victoria and James with various expenses, a down payment on their current house, private school tuition for the kids, a new car when theirs broke down. Each time, I'd written a check for whatever modest amount was expected of someone in my position, usually around $2,000 or $3,000, while quietly dying inside, knowing that I could have solved their problems with what amounted to pocket change for me. "Victoria and James are looking at a bigger house," my mother continued. "Something with a proper yard for the children and space for us to visit. The down payment is substantial, and we've already committed our savings. We're hoping everyone can chip in.
She looked directly at me. Even you, Caroline. I know you don't have much, but every little bit helps. Maybe you could contribute what you can afford, even if it's just a few $1,000s. Victoria had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Mom, you don't have to put Caroline on the spot like that. We know she's struggling with her little business. Little business, my father echoed. Caroline, what exactly do you even do? I've been telling people for years that you work in tech, but I don't actually know what that means. Do you fix computers, set up email accounts, help people recover passwords? He chuckled. I had to reset my email password 3 times last month. Maybe I should hire you. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a dramatic break, more like a quiet click, the sound of a door unlocking. I'd spent 7 years hiding my success, partly out of a desire to avoid family drama, and partly because I wanted to see if anyone would value me for who I was, rather than what I had. I had my answer. They didn't. I pulled out my phone, ignoring my mother's comment about how rude it was to check phones at the dinner table. I run a cybersecurity consulting firm, I said calmly. We specialize in threat assessment and digital infrastructure protection for major corporations and financial institutions. I founded the company 7 years ago with money I saved from my first job out of MIT. My father blinked. MIT? You went to community college? No, Dad. I went to MIT on a full academic scholarship. You didn't come to my graduation because it conflicted with Victoria's baby shower. I kept my voice level. Not accusing, just stating facts. You asked me not to make a fuss about it because family was more important than some ceremony. Victoria's face had gone pale. Caroline, I don't think this is the time. My company currently has 43 employees, I continued, pulling up my banking app. We have offices in New York, San Francisco, and London. Last quarter, our revenue was $18.7 million. I turned my phone around, showing them my primary business account balance. This is one of 6 accounts. This particular one has $3.2 million in it. It's my operating expenses account. The silence around the table was deafening. My mother's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. James's mouth had literally fallen open. Victoria was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned white. My father just stared at the phone screen as if it might be a hallucination. That's impossible, my mother finally whispered. If you had that kind of money, why didn't you help us before? Why did you let us think? Because you never asked what I did, I said simply. You never visited my office, never asked to see my apartment, never showed any interest in my actual life. You decided what my life looked like, and nothing I said could change that narrative. I pulled up another app, this one showing my investment portfolio. I'm worth $15.2 million as of this morning. My financial advisor called during the drive over to discuss moving some assets around. I opened my email and showed them the Forbes movification. I'm being featured in Forbes next month. They called me one of the most innovative minds in cybersecurity. The photo shoot was last week. They're sending a journalist to interview me at my office next Tuesday. Victoria found her voice. But you never said anything. You let us think you were barely scraping by. You wore regular clothes and drove a normal car. And I drove a normal car to family events, I corrected. I own a Tesla Model S and an Audi e-tron. They're parked at my building in Tribeca. I wore regular clothes because the last time I wore something designer to a family dinner, Mom asked if I'd put it on a credit card I couldn't afford. I looked at my mother. It was a Valentino dress. I paid cash for it. It cost $6,000 and I bought it without thinking twice because that's what I spent on coffee that month. My father had recovered enough to sound angry. If this is true, why didn't you help your sister? Why did you let us struggle to support her? I laughed and it came out more bitter than I intended. Dad, Victoria isn't struggling. You're supporting her lifestyle, but she and James make over $300,000 a year combined. They don't need a bigger house. They want one. There's a difference. I looked at Victoria. I checked. James's real estate commissions are public record, and your company posts salary ranges on Glassdoor. You're doing very well by any objective measure. You're just not doing as well as you want to do. I stood up, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care. I came to these dinners for 7 years and listened to you belittle me, diminish my work, and treat me like a charity case. I wrote checks to help with Victoria's expenses, even though I knew they didn't need them, because I thought maybe it would earn me a place at this table. But it never did. My mother was crying now, mascara running down her carefully made-up face. Caroline, honey, we didn't know. If you just told us. I tried. 3 years ago at Christmas, I mentioned that my company had just closed a major deal. Dad told me to stop exaggerating and said I should focus on finding a husband instead of playing pretend CEO. 2 years ago at Easter, I mentioned that I'd been invited to speak at a tech conference in Singapore. Victoria said it was probably a scam and that I should be careful about giving out my personal information online. I picked up my Bottega Veneta bag, the one they never questioned because they couldn't fathom that I'd spent $4,500 on a purse. Every single time I tried to share my success, you found a way to dismiss it or minimize it or turn it into a joke. So I stopped trying. I showed up and played the role you'd assigned me, the disappointing daughter who couldn't get her life together. James finally spoke up, his voice weak. Caroline, we're sorry. We really are. If you'd known I had money, you would have treated me differently, I finished for him. That's exactly the problem. My worth to this family has always been measured in how I compared to Victoria, or how I could be useful to your narrative. It was never about who I actually am as a person. I walked towards the door, and for once, no one tried to stop me. My mother's sobs followed me through the hallway, along with my father's attempts to calm her down. I could hear Victoria saying something about how they'd just been teasing, that I was being too sensitive, that family was supposed to be able to joke around.
I turned back one last time. Mom, you asked if everyone could chip in for Victoria's down payment. Here's my contribution. I pulled out my checkbook, the one from my private wealth management account at JP Morgan, and wrote a check. I placed it on the entry table. That's $500,000. It should cover the down payment and then some. Consider it my final payment for 7 years of family dinners. My father picked up the check, his hands trembling. Caroline, this is too much. We can't accept. Sure you can, I said. You've been accepting my help for years. You just didn't know the help came from someone you decided was a failure. I opened the front door, letting in the cold November air. The difference is, this is the last check I'll ever write to this family. Not because I can't afford it, but because I finally understand that I've been trying to buy something that was never for sale. The Uber ride back to my apartment in Manhattan took 45 minutes, long enough for my phone to start exploding with text messages. Victoria wanted to talk, Mom was devastated, Dad said I was being unreasonable, James tried to play mediator, suggesting a family meeting to clear the air. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I called my best friend Rachel, who'd been telling me for years to cut my family off. How did it go? She asked, knowing I'd been planning to finally tell them the truth. About as well as expected, I said, watching the city lights blur past. They're devastated that they misjudged me, but mostly because they feel foolish, not because they hurt me. Are you okay? Rachel's voice was soft, concerned. I thought about it for a moment. Actually, I think I am. For the first time in 7 years, I feel okay. My apartment in Tribeca in Manhattan was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Pristine, modern, and utterly mine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River, and the open-concept living space was decorated with carefully curated art pieces that I'd collected from galleries around the world. This was the life I'd built, the one my family had never seen because they never asked to see it.
Little did my family realize that their rejection had been the final push I needed to stop seeking their approval. I poured myself a glass of wine from my personal collection, the same vintage we'd had at dinner, but this bottle was from my own cellar, purchased with money I'd earned through my own brilliance and hard work. I settled onto my custom Italian leather sofa and opened my laptop to review the Forbes article draft they'd sent me earlier that week. The journalist had captured something essential about my journey. Mitchell's success isn't just about technical innovation, it's about seeing possibilities where others see limitations. If only she knew how true that was, not just in business, but in life. The text from my family continued throughout the evening, escalating from apologetic to angry to desperately conciliatory. My mother sent a long message about how she'd always loved me, she'd just been worried about me, she just wanted me to be happy. Victoria sent a voice memo explaining that she'd only made fun of me because she thought I could take a joke, that she'd never meant anything by it, that I was being oversensitive. My father's message was the most revealing. Caroline, your mother is very upset. This kind of stress isn't good for her health. I think you should apologize for ruining Thanksgiving and for embarrassing us all with your dramatic exit. If you really have the kind of success you claim, then you should understand the importance of family reputation. We can discuss this like adults, but first, you need to acknowledge that you handled this poorly. I read his message 3 times, looking for any hint of actual remorse or understanding. There was none. Even faced with irrefutable proof of my success, he was more concerned about how my revelation made him look than how his treatment had made me feel. I didn't respond. Instead, I did something I should have done years ago. I drafted an email to my entire family outlining clear boundaries. I wouldn't be attending family events for the foreseeable future. I would no longer be contributing financially to family expenses. I would be happy to have individual relationships with family members who were willing to see me as an actual person rather than a supporting character in Victoria's story. But those relationships would need to be rebuilt from the ground up with mutual respect and genuine interest. The phone call I received that night would change everything one more time. It wasn't from my family, but from my lawyer, Patricia Chen, who had helped me set up my corporate structure years ago. She'd seen the flurry of activity on my accounts and wanted to make sure everything was okay. I told her I'm fine, curled up on my sofa with my second glass of wine. I finally told my family the truth about my finances. Patricia was quiet for a moment. How did they take it? Exactly as badly as you'd expect, I said, but also I think it needed to happen. I've been hiding for so long that I forgot why I was hiding in the first place. What are you going to do now? She asked. I looked around my beautiful apartment at the life I'd built entirely on my own terms. I'm going to stop hiding, I said. I'm going to stop making myself smaller to make other people comfortable. I'm going to accept that Forbes feature and do the interview and let them photograph my office and my apartment and everything I've built. I'm going to stop being ashamed of my success. The next few days were revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother called 17 times before I finally answered. When I did pick up, her first words weren't an apology, but a question. Is it really true? Do you really have $15 million? Yes, I said simply. You just don't understand why you hid it from us, she said, her voice taking on that wounded tone she'd perfected over the years. We're your family. We could have been celebrating your success this whole time. Could you have? I asked. Because every time I tried to share any success, even small ones, you found a way to diminish it. What would have been different if I'd told you the actual numbers? She was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, I suppose I thought you needed our help. It made me feel useful having a daughter who needed me. It was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. But I haven't needed your help since I was 22, I said gently, and instead of being proud of that, you resented it. You preferred the version of me that was struggling because it fit the narrative better. That's not fair, Caroline. Isn't it? I looked out at the river, watching the boats drift past. Tell me honestly, Mom, If I had told you 7 years ago that I'd just started a company and signed my first major client for $200,000, what would you have said? Another long silence. Then, quietly, I probably would have warned you about getting your hopes up. I would have told you that most businesses fail and that you should have a backup plan. Exactly, I said. You would have treated my biggest triumph as a disaster waiting to happen. So I stopped sharing. It was easier to let you think I was barely getting by than to constantly defend my success against your skepticism. My sister's approach was different. She showed up at my building 3 days after Thanksgiving, somehow having gotten my address from my mother, who I'd forgotten even had it. The doorman called up, and I almost told him to send her away, but curiosity got the better of me. Victoria stood in my doorway, staring at my apartment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Jesus, Caroline, this place is incredible. I let her in, watching as she took in the art on the walls, the designer furniture, the pristine kitchen with appliances that cost more than most people's cars. This is how you really live, she said. It wasn't a question. This is how I've lived for 5 years. Before this, I had a smaller place in the West Village. Before that, a studio in Brooklyn that I bought outright when I was 25. She sank onto my sofa without asking, her expensive dress looking suddenly cheap against my furnishings. I was so mean to you, she said quietly. All those comments about your little business and your computer thing, I was so patronizing. Yes, you were, I agreed, not sugarcoating it. I think I knew, she admitted. Not the extent of it, but I think part of me knew you were doing better than you let on. The way you never seemed stressed about money, the way you always had time to travel, little things like your manicures being obviously from a high-end salon. I think I knew, and I chose to mock it anyway because it was easier than admitting that you'd succeeded beyond anything I'd ever accomplish. I sat down across from her, maintaining distance. Why did you do it, Victoria? Why did you need me to be the failure? She wiped at her eyes, and I noticed her manicure was chipped. Because you were always the smart one. Everyone knew it. You were the one with the scholarship to MIT, the one who could have done anything, and I was just the pretty one, the one who was good at playing the game. When you came back after graduation and didn't immediately become some tech superstar, it felt like validation. Like maybe I'd made the right choices after all, marrying young and focusing on family. But I did become a superstar, I said. You just didn't see it because you didn't want to. I know, she whispered. And my mom and dad didn't want to see it either because it disrupted the family narrative. I was the good daughter who did everything right, and you were the weird one who didn't fit in. If you were actually wildly successful, then